welcome to a new episode of Policy Implications podcast, where policy meets research. I'm your host, Olga Zadorozhna from Kozminski University, where I teach and do research in empirical economics. My guest today is Dr. Raluca Pahontu, who is a political economist working on issues related to risk and insurance, inequality, distributional conflict, and voting behavior. Currently, Raluca is a postdoctoral fellow at the London School of Economics. Today, we will be discussing her recent paper called Mind the Gap, Why Wealthy Voters Support Brexit, which is co-authored with Jane Green. This paper raises a very interesting topic of wealth being an important factor in political decision-making and explains why wealthy people might have been more inclined to vote for Brexit. So welcome, Raluca, and let's get started. But before we dive into the discussion of the paper, please tell us more about your research and how did you become interested in the topics of voting behavior and decision-making in general, and in context of Brexit in particular.
Hello to the listeners of the podcast, and of course to you, Olga. It's such a pleasure to take part. Thank you so much for having me. In terms of my research interests, I'm broadly interested, as the kind introduction you have mentioned suggested, in understanding individuals' economic and political preferences. And I argue that individual experiences may have an impact on these preferences and related behavior, which of course may vary from attitudes towards risk or vote choice, or indeed support for a referendum, as in the case of Brexit. For a long time, we thought that some of these preferences and behaviors are sticky. And this just means that mainly upbringing, but other individual characteristics as well, make it more likely for an individual to display a particular type of behavior. In my work, I take a more rationalist approach and argue that individuals are largely motivated by self-interest, and whenever their circumstances changes, economic or otherwise, of course, so does their behavior. Whether this is true, of course, matters quite a bit, because we're interested in what drives public opinion changes. And one challenge in that is identifying whose preferences change. Ultimately, who do we vote for, or whether the UK decides to stay in the EU or not, has important consequences for the livelihoods of those involved, varying, of course, from things like price of goods or free movement opportunities, as in the case of Brexit or membership in the EU, to public goods provision, immigration policy, and others in the case of domestic politics. Of course, Brexit in particular is a very interesting case, and that's because it was assumed to fall in favor of the status quo almost up until the end. In fact, recent experiences with referendums in Europe and elsewhere have vindicated a status quo bias, which means that individuals prefer the current situation to an alternative, more uncertain one. In the case of Brexit, a very narrow majority of voters, 51.9%, supported leaving from the EU, amongst, of course, considerable uncertainty over whether the country's prospect of leaving the EU with a trade deal was realistic or possible, or indeed whether it was possible to secure trade agreements with other countries. And the fact that the outcome of the referendum was supportive, as we know, of a change in the status quo is of great interest to myself and my co-author, Jane Green, in part because this was unexpected, and in part because so much of the narrative has focused on the left behind. And these are individuals who have lost from globalization or the free movement, and essentially wanted to curb immigration as a response to some of these economic challenges.
Very interesting. So before your paper, what did we know about the distribution of votes in the Brexit referendum? And why do you think people have voted out of the EU? Have you done any maybe cost-benefit analysis?
Right, indeed. So I think I was tapping a bit into that earlier. So a large focus has been placed on the study between Brexit and economic insecurity, whether that's in the form of direct sort of economic grievances, or of course some sort of indirect effects of the relationship between economic insecurity and immigration concerns. And actually a number of empirical patterns have emerged, both at the individual level as well as at a more aggregate level, with respect to what correlates to Brexit support. And in particular, there's evidence, for example, that areas with declining manufacturing jobs or higher inequality were more likely to support leave. More specifically, support for leave was traced to places that experienced the economic and social consequences of globalization, import shocks, or even austerity measures. But focusing on income can only tell part of the story. So oftentimes in research, we use income to proxy wealth or financial well-being more broadly, in the expectation that the two things are correlated. In a snapshot, that of course may be true, but over several time periods, changes in income may not be reflected in wealth levels and vice versa. So if high incomes provide a buffer against misfortune, it does so through the accumulation of wealth made possible by savings and asset holding. Because otherwise, income is so transitory that it may not offer the same type of economic security as wealth would. And this is essentially because individuals experiencing a drop in income, absent wealth, cannot smooth consumption. So the way we think about it is that wealth provides a permanent stock of financial means to buffer against risk. And as I was just explaining now, the same cannot be said of a person's income if that person does not have wealth. So to understand that, think of how different experiences two individuals may have. Suppose both recently unemployed, but one of them having a source of wealth to fall back on and the other one not. Asset ownership, for example, is associated strongly with the ability to borrow, and borrowing ability, therefore, provides additional economic security against short-term income losses. Therefore, the individual that I mentioned, able to privately insure herself against a bad outcome, is in a better, different, if you will, position than her non-wealthy counterpart. In terms of costs and benefits that you asked, the literature mostly focuses, I think, on the benefits for leavers, and sort of assumed that there weren't costs, or that the benefits somehow outweighed the costs. And it was, of course, generally assumed that the project fear didn't really work. So there wasn't as much focus on the impact of risk, or on why actually so many Eurosceptics supported Remain. And this is, of course, something we look at in our paper. And we believe that the results we have, and in particular the insurance mechanism we propose, may help explain a bit this pattern. So just to preview a bit that, we might think that project fear worked in determining some people, especially those lacking insurance, to vote against the status quo, despite their preferences to do otherwise.
So it's very interesting that you look at wealth as an economic insurance against political risks. And so what data did you use in your study, and how exactly did you define your wealth variable?
So we're interested in, obviously, two important things, one of them being wealth, and the other one, of course, being the leave vote. And it's typically very difficult to find measures of both in the same place, because national election surveys that typically include political preferences rarely include individual wealth measures. And on the other hand, federal banking data sets that include quite a range of measures of wealth rarely include measures of political preferences. So in our case, we managed to find this rare opportunity to use two data sets, one from the British election study, and the other one from the Bank of England's panel survey of income and expenditure, that contain both of these key variables that I mentioned. So in terms of support for leave, we distinguish, of course, between respondents' intention and support for Brexit. And in the former data set that I mentioned, the British election study, voters are asked to imagine they had to vote in a referendum and how basically state their vote intention. Whereas in the Bank of England data, respondents were asked about their support for the current situation, which was, of course, the fact that UK voted to leave the EU. And this was important to basically make sure that vote intention was not related to the respondents' assessment of the possibility of a second referendum. With respect to the other variable, the wealth variable, we distinguish between financial and property wealth in our paper. So liquid wealth, which is the former, is just readily available savings, of course, net of debts. And this may compensate for short-term income losses, smoothing, of course, consumption in the short term, as I was saying earlier. But of course, unlike expectation from consumption and saving smoothing over the life cycle, in practice, what we see is that very few people actually accumulate substantial savings. And this is especially true in the UK case where we look at where property wealth is actually substantially higher than financial wealth. So for example, just to give you a sense of the data from a few years ago shows that the mean UK property wealth was around £85,000, in contrast to only about £28,000 in savings. And this is quite a sticky characteristic of the UK system, partly because of some government-induced incentives to take up home ownership in the 80s, and of course the subsequent appreciation of home prices as well.
So once you had your data, and indeed great that you were able to find those measures. So what was your main estimation strategy then, and what were your main findings?
Right. So the starting point, I think, is to say that the literature on determinants of Brexit uses cross-sectional comparisons. So what this just means is that we end up comparing individuals of similar age, education, income, etc. But we are unable to account for things we do not know about individuals. So the worry is that more educated individuals or higher earners or wealthier people, for example, have some characteristics that make them systematically different than others. For example, they may work harder or be more motivated or more cosmopolitan. And because of these factors, oftentimes such analysis could be misleading, as these factors we cannot account for that I just mentioned may instead drive some of these behaviors we observe. So we're aware of these dangers, and to address that, we've run 3 different types of analysis. But possibly one which is more useful allows us to control for unobserved time invariant individual heterogeneity, which in very simple words, it just means that we make a very simple comparison, which is we compare the same person over time with herself. And this is useful since most attributes we don't know about an individual that, of course, don't vary over time are accounted for, right? So think of upbringing or xenophobia or even education. And all these are very important determinants of support for Brexit. And in terms of what these results suggest, we find that property wealth is a much bigger determinant of the probability to support leave. But a financial wealth may have had an effect as well. And we also confirmed through a hypothetical gamble experiment what myself and others have previously found, which is that wealth affects individuals' willingness to take risks, such that wealthier individuals are more risk-taking. And we also see a bit that those with higher wealth thought that they would personally be less affected by Brexit than those on lower wealth, which of course we interpret as evidence of this insurance mechanism. So I guess together the results we think may explain why wealthier individuals were more likely to support Brexit.
And so your research result basically suggests that political interests of those who are the most vulnerable economically were not met in the case of Brexit vote. So how can policymakers support those voters now? What can they do to support them?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. And I guess it's going to depend a little bit on how things plan out. But for example, one thing that the research suggests is that less wealthy or generally poorer voters, for example, are less likely to turn up in elections, right? So they're less represented politically. And of course, there are several ways that this can be tackled from a policy perspective, such as through campaigns encouraging people to turn out or giving people free time from work to go vote on election day. And these are just some of the ways we have to tackle some of these issues. There's also quite a bit of research on the relationship between inequality and redistribution preferences, for example. And what we show in addition is that poor voters do not just have different political preferences, which is what this literature tends to suggest, but of course they also lack the insurance to be able to act on some of those preferences, right? So think back of the Eurosceptics voting Remain example that sort of were puzzling us. So economic inequalities may create inequalities in experience, right, in preferences, and of course in risk-taking as well, as I explained a second ago. And of course, Brexit needs to deliver to these people who wanted to vote for it, but weren't financially prepared. In terms of what we can do to tackle this, I mean, again, there are several ways potentially. So governments tend to help people that may be affected, obviously negatively by shocks via social insurance programs, right? So you can think here, for example, of unemployment benefits. And it's likely that the government would potentially have to continue doing that, much like what we've seen, of course, in the response to the pandemic in this country, and may just simply have to respond to some of these potential spillover effects if the economy suffers with Brexit.
Yeah, that's indeed a very important issue, especially nowadays that we live in the world of pandemics, and those the most vulnerable economically, they become more vulnerable health-wise as well. So thank you very much, Raluca, for an interesting discussion. And I do hope that policymakers in the UK, but also in the EU, will take the results of your paper seriously and will make well-informed policy-making choices. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.